Hello and welcome back to Triple Crown Wargaming with me, the Duke, and today it is my turn to take you through the latest Old World Almanac from Games Workshop, and it is of course all about morale and psychology. So we are going to start off where the article starts off. We're going to start with morale. Now we get to see the little sort of break test example table that they showed off last week in the combat article, and sort of briefly go over it again. If you fail the leadership test after losing combat, if you fail a leadership test on your basic leadership value, then you break and flee. If you pass it on your standard basic leadership test, but fail it given the modifiers for what you lost combat by, then you fall back in good order. And if you pass the leadership test on both the modified and the sort of normal standard leadership, then you just give ground. Now though, what we've got is a little bit more info on what those three things mean. So first off, let's start with break and flee. Probably the one that most people guessed what was going to happen. So if you do break and flee from combat, you turn and run in the opposite direction from whatever caused you to flee. And it does mention here as well, I think crucially, in a little bracketed part of the sentence, that unit strength is back. Because if there's multiple enemy units in a combat, then you flee from whichever unit has the higher unit strength. Now, that's quite interesting. I wonder how much else unit strength will have an effect on. It wasn't mentioned in the combat article last week, so don't know. Maybe this is the only role it will play in sort of combat and psychology. Maybe that's the only part it will play in the game. Who knows? I can't see it myself. I think maybe that's one of the things they didn't tell us about combat, potentially, how sort of unit strength was going to affect it. But in general, I like the idea that unit strength is back. But back to break and flee. So if they break and flee, they run 2d6 directly away, basically, from the unit that caused it. They avoid impassable terrain, sort of going around it, pivoting around it, which is changed to 8th. A change I quite like, to be honest. Never really made a lot of sense that units would just sort of flee through impassable terrain and there not really be a downside to that. You did take dangerous terrain, but it's only a 6th of the time, not the end of the world. And as I think most people would have probably guessed, if any part of the fleeing unit crosses a battlefield edge, then it is destroyed. If you do break and flee, the enemy can chase you, very similar to how it works in 8th edition. Roll 2d6. If they chase you, then the fleeing unit is destroyed. Again, slight changes here with running through units. If you run through an enemy unit, you just take additional wounds. Doesn't say if they're sort of like you test to take the wounds, like a dangerous terrain test, like we have now in 8th, or if it's just you take, I don't know, d6 wounds, something like that. Don't know. It'll be interesting to see what that is. And then, obviously, running through a friendly unit, you are fine. No suggestion that it might cause panic in the friendly unit, though that is one thing they don't really touch on in this article, is panic. So it could still do. Who knows? But then, obviously, the pursuer can then hit that other friendly unit and potentially engage them in combat. Very similar to how it works in 8th. On to the next one then, fall back in good order. So they're still retreating in a fair way, but they're not, completely broken. So again, you roll the 2d6, but this time you discard the lower, so you only go the highest of the two, and then you automatically rally and reform at the end of it. So, and I think from what they've said there, I think that is a immediate rally and reform. That's not a, start of your next turn, then you rally then and reform then. I think that's an immediate. You effectively move backwards the highest of 2d6, which is interesting. It's going to really move the lines of combat quite a lot throughout the game, which I think is quite good. And then giving ground, similar, except you just move back 2 inches. It does say terrain permitting, so again I would suggest that if you can't move back the full 2, you just move back as far as you can. Could be some differences there though, but that's what I would guess. And then the winner of the combat will then get a chance to follow up if they wish to, but that is their choice. So that's sort of how morale will work in combat. And overall, some big changes, some not so big changes. A lot of it is very similar and will feel very much the same, to be honest, as 8th edition. It will feel very common to a lot of people, which I think is good. But the changes they have put in, what we've seen of it so far, I've got to say I do like. I'm a fan of the changes, and actually I'm a fan of a lot more of this article as well, which we'll look at now as we get into psychology and the psychology part. So they do mention that all of these special rules, which I'll sort of list off: fear, terror, stupidity, animosity, frenzy, unbreakable, stubborn, and hatred, these are all now universal special rules. Now, most of them were universal special rules anyway. Animosity wasn't, which is interesting. It makes me wonder if maybe not just orcs and goblins will have animosity. I'm not really sure what else would make sense for it to have animosity. Maybe some monsters, perhaps, if the way you test changes. That could be interesting. Really trying to read between the lines there. They've not really made it clear what else might have animosity. Just trying to read between the lines because it's now a universal special rule. But what they really look at in this article is fear and terror. So starting off with fear, obviously 8th edition, it was just you take a leadership test if you're in combat with a fear-causing unit. If you fail, your weapon skill 1 for that round of combat. Very different now, and I've got to say, like I said before, big fan, because I never felt that fear or terror really did enough in 8th edition. Part of that was because of the abundance of high leadership, almost army-wide rerolls with BSBs and Inspiring Presence, and part of it was because really, a lot of the time, the weapon skill 1 didn't make a huge difference, and to be honest, like I said, you never really felt it anyway. It was, when it did, it was helpful, but it never really felt like a huge disadvantage for a lot of units. You know, units with rerolls, they'd probably get around it if they didn't just pass anyway. There was lots of, well, a fair amount of immune psychology, that sort of thing. So yeah, it never really came up that much. This time though, in Old World, if a unit wants to charge a fear-causing unit with a higher unit strength, they've got to take a leadership test, or its charge will fail. Now, they don't specify exactly when you take the leadership test, but from that, I think you declare the charge, then take the leadership test. If you fail it, you failed the charge. You can't charge. Whether that means you stumble d6 forwards, whether that means you don't move at all, not sure. But I think it will mean you can't then move normally for that turn. You can't then just go, oh well, I can't charge, therefore I'll just move normally in the you know, the remaining moves phase. I don't think that will let you do that, which I think is huge. That's a really big change for me, and a really good change, a move in the right direction to actually make psychology do something, which it never really felt like it did in 8th. So yeah, looking forward to that, and I think that will be crucial, as well as the effects of terror, which I'll get into in a second. I think that will be really particularly good in armies where a lot or all of their units cause fear and have access to potentially dropping leadership values. Now, if we base that on 8th edition, really that's looking at vampire counts. You know, whole army caused fear, had access to Law of Death, had access to vampire powers that caused your leadership to drop within a certain range. I think that, if they still have those sort of abilities, that could be really, really huge for vampire counts. And as a vampire player with a very large vampire counts army, I am looking forward to that. Additionally, though, a bit like we had in 8th with the, you know, fail a leadership test, your weapon skill 1, we've now got, you take a leadership test, and if you fail, you are -1 to hit. Now, some ways I think this is better, other ways it's worse. It doesn't make the fear-causing unit hit you any easier, which, bit of a shame. Obviously, weapon skill 1, most of the time, most of those fear-causing units would hit you on a 3, unless you're a zombie. But now it's not going to affect what the fear-causing unit hits you on. But it will make a difference as to what the unit that failed the fear check hits you on all the time, no matter what. So a lot of the time it would have anyway, and it would have had the same effect. But, you know, if you're I'm trying to think, if you're something that's weapon skill 2 in 8th edition, and you're fighting a skeleton, doesn't matter if you pass or fail the fear check, you're hitting them on 4s. Because you go down to weapon skill 1, skeleton's weapon skill 2, there's no difference. At least this will now give you a little bit of a buff and go, actually, it's 5s for you to hit the skeleton. So I don't mind that. But I think in combination with the having to take a leadership test to charge them in the first place, really like what they've done with fear. Big fan of it. Terror then, as they say, is even worse. Not for the person with terror, it's much better. So if you are, similar to in 8th edition, if you're charged by a unit that has terror, take a leadership test, or you just have to flee. Exactly the same as it was in 8th edition. However, Terror also now applies an extra -1 to the opposing units at leadership when they take a break test. So making you much more likely to break from combat and for that terror causing unit to chase you down. I have said for a long time, I think fear and terror in some form should affect your leadership value. It shouldn't just be take a test and, if you fail it, this happens. I've always thought it should affect your leadership value in some way, and I really like how this is implemented. It's not exactly how I would have done it personally, but I'm not writing the rules, so it's not up to me. I probably would have included a leadership modifier in fear as well, maybe made it different for terror a bit more, or affect different things, but this -1 to your opponent's leadership when they're taking break tests, huge. As it said, makes you much more likely to actually break and flee from the combat rather than give ground or fall back in good order. And I really like that. Big fan of that. Particularly, I suppose, if, like I said before, you don't have that, BSB's giving you reroll for all leadership tests within a 12-inch bubble, or maybe Inspiring Presence isn't as much or as high as it was in 8th edition. I think that will be a really good change, and actually will be quite interesting to see when we get some more stat lines. Speaking of stat lines, we do get the stats and some special rules of the Dragon Ogre Shaggoth. Stat line very similar, if not exactly the same, as 8th edition. Really, really good monster. But some special rules we haven't seen before. And actually some special rules I think that say a lot. So, Armour Bane we have seen before on I think it was on the longbow from the shooting article. It was Armour Bane 1 then. Armour Bane 2 on this guy. We don't know what it does yet. I think it will probably have something to do with how much AP their attacks have. Whether that's a constant AP 2, although it feels like you'd put AP -2 on his attacks. Or it's, under certain circumstances is AP -2, don't know. But that would be my guess. Armoured Hired, I would guess, is like a Scaly Skin equivalent, so that'd give him +2 to his save. Now, Close Order, this is going back to, was it first, maybe second? I think it was the second Almanac they did on movement and formations. And this was what they sort of described as like a sort of standard regimented unit. He's in this sort of close order formation. Now, the fact it's on a monster, well, I'm assuming it's still a monster anyway, is interesting. So there must be some other buffs, some other sort of interactions with the formation that you are in for a Dragon Ogre Shaggoth, a monster, and a single model to need that close order. It's interesting, it's a special rule as well. Maybe only certain units will be able to adopt close order, otherwise they'll be open. Don't know, could be interesting. Little, again, sort of reading between the lines there. Very interesting. In Source of Weapons, another one we haven't seen. If you go on 8th edition, that just means magical attacks. Possibly means exactly the same. Could mean something totally different. We will have to wait and see. Immune Psychology, they don't actually mention what that means in this article. Bit of a shame. But before it meant you couldn't flee as a charge reaction. I think it could, to be honest, be exactly the same, because going further down, he does have terror, so which would suggest he is then immune to fear and terror himself. Though, it's worth saying, actually thinking about it, they don't mention that. They don't mention that a unit that causes fear is immune to fear in other units and terror and vice versa. So maybe it doesn't. Maybe terror causing units, if they're not also immune to psychology, would suffer from the -1 leadership from other terror causing units. Yeah, hadn't thought about that. Interesting. Not sure how I feel about that, to be honest. I suppose I don't hate it. You're probably going to find that if that is the case, I imagine a lot of monsters will have immune psychology. Though that might mean they can't flee. Upsides, downsides. Yeah, interesting. Large target, I would assume, does similar things. Stomp attacks. Now, this is another one. D3 +1 stomp. So for me, what that says is Thunder Stomp as a rule is gone. And you'll have a value like we've got here, D3 +1 for your stomp. So I think, for instance, Monstrous Infantry would likely, if they still have stomps, would likely just have 1 like they have now, so in 8th edition. And then the smaller monsters, so like the Dragon Ogre Shaggoth, maybe the Vargolf from Vampire Counts, maybe they'll get, 2d3. Maybe they'll get a d3 plus 3, something like that. d3 plus 3 feels really good. Maybe it'll just be a flat d6, don't know. And then bigger monsters maybe gets 2d3, or, like a dragon maybe gets 2d3, or 2d3 plus 1 plus 2, something like that. So, which, again, like we've said before, I really like the fact that a lot of these rules now scale to the sizes and of the models that have them, which I think makes a lot of sense, to be fair. And then the other two, obviously it's got Terror as well. The other two rules, Stormcore and Quickening Storm, feel like they're going to be unique to the Shoggoth, so I'm not really going to go into them too much. But I think it's worth saying, even in the psychology article, when they give us these sort of special rules and things and stat lines, I think you can see a lot of things that aren't necessarily related to psychology in there, like the stomp attacks, like Armorbane, Armoured Hide, Close Order as well. And of course, they do show us another spell. And I chat a little bit about Frenzy. So does the same thing, gives a unit an extra attack. It also makes them immune to Fear and Terror, not immune to Panic, interestingly. So potentially, before Frenzy would make you immune to Psychology, they also don't mention immune to Psychology here, just immune from Fear and Terror. So potentially Frenzied units are going to have to take Panic checks, if Panic checks are still a thing. They don't mention them at all here. Feels like this would be the article to have them in. So it's interesting. Maybe it's just something they've chosen to omit. They don't want to give away all of the secrets, of course. But yeah, interesting that they may now be panicking if you kill something next to them. Interesting. You can also still never choose to flee as a charge reaction. No real change there. But what might have changed, and I say might, again, might just be something they've omitted. Frenzied units must always charge if able to. No mention of a test to restrain. Very interesting. I feel like I've said that a lot, and I feel like I'm going to get some comments below that mention that I've said that a lot. But I do think it is very interesting. I'm going to say it again, because that's always been, particularly with the prevalence of Inspiring Presence, BSB rerolls, it's always felt like you could get around the downsides of Frenzy a lot by, I'm within general BSB, it's a leadership 9 with a reroll test, I should be fine. Now though, maybe that's not going to be a thing. I think it's worth taking into account that on average, charge ranges are going to be much shorter, maximum charge ranges, particularly for infantry. Any units really without Swift Stride, their charge ranges are going to be a lot smaller. So maybe it's not so much of a downside if there is no test to restrain mechanic. But back to the spell that I mentioned and then completely didn't talk about, Battle Lust from the Lore of Dark Magic. It's an enchantment spell, which I noticed someone said this means it's cast before you declare your charge. Cast in the strategy phase, I think. I think this one's one of the ones in the strategy phase. It's cast in a 9, so quite high for what we've seen. It might even be the highest one we've seen. And it basically gives the unit Frenzy and Hatred all enemies special rule. So not a massive change in that Hatred, in that it specifies now all enemies, whereas before you'd just have Hatred and it would be Hatred everyone. Just, I think, a bit of semantics really there. They're making it a little bit clearer that it's Hatred against everyone. Generally though, it seems a very good spell. Only range 12, so not a huge range, but yeah, it seems a really good spell. So the fact though that if the enchantments are indeed cast before you declare charges, if you cast this and know if it's gone off before you have to declare a charge, you're going to know if your unit's got the benefits or not. So, there's no... In 8th, you always had that, I've got these buff spells, but I'm going to have to declare a charge now, hope I get them off. Otherwise, I might get really easily beaten in this combat. Now, though, at least with this spell and these types of spells, you're going to know if you've got the buffs before you have to declare that charge. Again, not sure how I feel about that. Definitely makes the game very different. I think you'll get a lot more cagey responses from people, cagey games even, where you're only going to declare those charges if you've managed to get these spells off. But then you've got spells throughout the turn, so maybe as an opponent I let this spell go off, let you charge, and then I've got a spell that maybe takes away your frenzy or gives you minuses to hit, you know, something like that, so that maybe I don't mind you getting in and then I can sort of negate it or counter it later in the turn. So maybe not, maybe I'm sort of reading a bit too much into that. But they do say that next week's article is on magic, so we will hopefully find out a lot more about that then and about how that's going to work, which I, for one, am really interested in. But today's article, I've got to say, overall, big fan. I'm a really big fan of it. I like what they've done, particularly with terror. I'd also like what they've done with fear, with the whole having to take a fear check, having to take a leadership check to be able to charge a fear-causing unit. Like I said, I think it's going to make those army-wide fear-causing armies, traditionally like undead or ogres perhaps, bar, you know, nobblers, but they don't really count. I think it's going to make those armies, particularly ones, if there are any ways to modify leadership, I think it's going to make them really, really powerful. Give them a lot of control. And I like what we've seen of the changes to some monsters rules, like the changes to Stomp. Very interesting to see that Close Order is a special rule. Suggests that maybe units will have all of their potential formations listed as special rules. Yeah, that could be interesting. An interesting sort of mechanic to deal with. But yeah, overall, really big fan. What did you guys think of it? Let me know down below in the comments. And yeah, well, I can't wait for next week's article on magic. Really looking forward to that. It's the one that I've been waiting for the most, if I'm honest. So yeah, glad to know it is coming soon. But thank you for joining me on Triple Crown Wargaming here today. Let me know what you thought down below. Like, subscribe and share and all that fun. And we will see you next week for another Old World Almanac reaction video.
Remember to tag your friends and like, subscribe and share. Then head over to triplecrownwargaming.com and become a Knight of the Realm today.
What are you doing, mate?
You alright? Do it for Warhammer!